Call the member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To stand in this place and provide a fair go for Western Australia is an honour. Too often, Western Australians feel like they are the forgotten state of the Commonwealth. When it came to the distribution of the goods and services tax that Western Australians pay, that was definitely true. Today, the Parliament is recognising Western Australia. The Parliament is recognising the tax that Western Australians pay and the principle that they should get a fair share of that tax back in their state. It would be remiss of me not to start by congratulating some of the campaigners who have led to this reform. And it has been a campaign. It's been a campaign that's taken many years. I congratulate my fellow Labor colleagues, the WA Labor members of this place, the WA Labor senators. I also congratulate the Leader of the Opposition, the Shadow Treasurer and the Shadow Minister for Finance. They've all listened carefully to Western Australia. They've listened to what it is that Western Australians say they need. And they listened when Western Australians elected the Mark McGowan Labor government in 2017, saying the current team were unable to deliver a fair share for WA. And I also congratulate the now Treasurer of Western Australia, Ben Wyatt. It's not just been a campaign that has involved members of the parliaments of state and federal parliament. It's involved the West Australian, and once a week the Sunday Times also campaigns for a fair share of the GST for Western Australia. I also acknowledge a range of trade unions have campaigned to ensure that Western Australia gets its fair share so that we can fund the vital services that Western Australians rely on. And equally, the Western Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has been a loud and clear voice for change in the distribution of the GST. The goods and services tax, introduced on 1 July the year 2000. Back then, Deputy Speaker, I was in Year 10. My friends and I thought that, despite not being super keen on the introduction of the GST, a effectively regressive tax, we thought it would be nice to go and be some of the first Western Australians to pay the GST. So we hatched a plan that we'd go down to the local Maccas, we would wait till the clock struck midnight, and we would buy ourselves some McDonald's and pay the GST, being some of the first West Australians to do so. My parents did not think this was as good an idea, and I did not do that. But I raise the importance of visiting McDonald's because when we look at the share of the GST that Western Australia received, it got down to basically 30 cents in the dollar. Now, 30 cents in the dollar, or 30 cents, doesn't buy you much. But back in 2000, 30 cents would buy you a McDonald's ice cream. 30 cents no longer even buys you a McDonald's ice cream. In fact, in preparing for this speech, I've got to say I struggled to find much that you can buy for 30 cents these days, so I had to do some maths instead. 30 cents will buy you 3 kilograms of iron ore. 30 cents will buy you roughly 612 staples. It will buy you less than 500 millilitres of Coca-Cola. So it's no surprise that Western Australians thought that 30 cents in the dollar was completely unfair. It was a pittance and it was unacceptable. The need to provide Western Australia with a fair share of the GST is also a need for us at the federal level to make sure that we are providing what that state needs to run the state economy. When it comes to the suffering that Western Australia experienced during this time, we cannot understate that suffering. I think the anger is well highlighted by the fact that I've been able to count, and I'm sure this is an inaccurate number, it probably vastly understates the number of editorials, but there were 78 editorials in the past 6 years in the West Australian alone calling for reform of the GST. In fact, one report in the West Australian revealed that Western Australia had lost almost a third of the GST collected since the inception of the GST in 2000. In other words, 1/3 or $30 billion taken out of Western Australia and redistributed to other states, as we saw that share of the GST decline below 70 cents, below 50 cents, and down to that embarrassing just over 30 cents. Now, $30 billion taken out of Western Australia is a huge sum. For $30 billion, Western Australia could have purchased the entirety of Caltex Australia, Seek Limited, Coca-Cola Amatil, and still have had change to buy Domino's Pizza, although I don't think there's much of an argument that I can make in this place to have any government, state or federal, in the pizza delivery business. But nonetheless, there is no doubt there is a need to redistribute some money to other states to accommodate for the different challenges that different states face at different points in the economic cycle. However, no one ever expected that we would get to this point of unfairness. Indeed, former Prime Minister and the architect of the goods and services tax, he proudly says it's one of his greatest achievements, but former Prime Minister John Howard said that it was never going to be necessary for top-up payments of the GST. In fact, when he announced the goods and services tax, Mr Howard said, quote, "For as long as any of you can remember, one of the least ignobling characteristics of government in this country has been the annual begging bowl pilgrimage to Canberra by the states." Well, Deputy Speaker, the system that was created by the introduction of the goods and services tax led to exactly that on a grand scale. It led to my state of Western Australia having to beg for top-up payments just to make sure they could keep the essential services of the state running. It's not good enough. It's not been good for any part of our Commonwealth to see that be part of our distribution of funds across our states and territories. I'm going to follow on from the member for O'Connor and commend former Prime Minister Turnbull for his work on this package. Mr Turnbull had a cooperative approach. He recognised that when Western Australians voted for the Mark McGowan Labor government, that they were sending a message all the way to Canberra. They were sending a message that we needed to address this problem. It was the #1 issue on the minds of many Western Australians when they thought about what did fairness from a federal government mean to them. But Prime Minister Turnbull was listening to Premier McGowan, and I'm pleased that with the passage of this legislation, we'll see him and Treasurer Ben Wyatt begin to return the state's budget to a surplus position and begin to repay debt. But you can't spend all of these funds just on repaying debt. You have to build for the future. You have to invest in the future. There are many projects in Western Australia that may be able to get off the ground because Western Australia now has a stronger budget position and can think about what else might be needed to grow the Western Australian economy. One would be the investing in a light rail system across our city through my electorate of Perth, connecting places like Curtin University, the Burswood Peninsula, Elizabeth Quay, all the way up to Kings Park, a beautiful tourist attraction, and on to the Medical Precinct and the University of Western Australia. This may also allow the state government and their body, the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, to finally fix the eyesore and the disgrace that is the rotting of the East Perth Power Station and turn it into a national tourist icon, possibly full of art, culture, music, or a museum of national significance. We could also invest and reinvest in our community at a local level. I know that other members will be speaking on a range of things that we could invest in, including community sport and community infrastructure. Whatever the case, when we get to the point of looking at how the nation has got to this point of debating this legislation, you have to accept that it's only because Labor has led this debate time and time again that we've got the legislation that we do in front of us today. Indeed, it was the opposition leader and Labor which first proposed significant and serious top-up payments to lift Western Australia's share of the distribution of the goods and services tax. Indeed, it was on Saturday, the 26th of August 2017, when opposition leader Bill Shorten announced that a Shorten Labor government would invest $1.6 billion in a fair share for WA fund. That was carefully considered policy aimed at making sure that we delivered a fair share for WA without making any state worse off. It was the first time we saw a concrete proposal to deliver an effective floor of GST for Western Australia, delivering a 70-cent floor. It was then at my campaign launch in July of this year, Deputy Speaker, that the opposition leader said we should make the floor the law. And that was a great initiative to say, if you're going to have a floor on the GST, you have to legislate it. It's the only way that you give certainty to the state that, in fairness, had some pretty good reasons for not trusting that they were going to get a fair share from Canberra. What the opposition leader said, and I quote, "We also have a plan for the GST. We have a plan which Labor has led, working with the McGowan government and Labor nationally to establish a floor. And what we say today is that not only do we support there being a 75-cent floor, we want to turn the floor into the law." End quote. It was a promise that was eventually adopted by the government. And it was good that the government listened to the opposition leader and agreed to legislate. It was also the opposition leader and the Shadow Treasurer who said that we must legislate to make sure that no state is worse off. And I'm joined by a number of colleagues from Tasmania who rightly have seen what happened to Western Australia. They've seen this state have its budget smashed by an unfair distribution of the GST and said, well, what happened in Western Australia is pretty bad. It would be terrible if, in fixing one state's problem, we were to start smashing another state's budget. And one of the things that I commend my Tasmanian colleagues for is actually looking to the future. What former Prime Minister Howard and then Treasurer in Western Australia, then later Premier Colin Barnett, failed to do was look to the long-term effect. You could see that there was a huge mining boom on the way. The distribution formula was already on paper, but no one actually thought what happens in different economic circumstances. And so I commend my Tasmanian colleagues for actually thinking through the implications of what we do. And again, I commend the Shadow Treasurer for making sure that we've looked at this legislation, called for a no state worse off guarantee, and credit to the current Prime Minister and credit to the current Treasurer, they've listened and they've enacted that in the legislation before us today. There are, of course, other tax policies that the current Prime Minister and current Treasurer may wish to look at in developing a fair economy for all Australians. One is Labor's tax refund for working Australians. Labor's policy will deliver a bigger, fairer tax cut for 10 million working Australians. Labor has proposed reforms to dividend imputation, ensuring that we deliver billions of dollars back to the bottom line of the budget and remove excess cash refunds from dividend imputation credits. Reform to capital gains tax and negative gearing, limiting where you can claim those negative gearing amounts, and reducing the discounts to ensure our tax system is fair and equitable. And probably most importantly, when it comes to making sure that we get a fair share of tax here in Australia for all Australians, a comprehensive package on multinational tax avoidance, which will improve the budget bottom line by $3 billion over the decade. In addition, Labor will restore integrity to Australia's tax system and stop Australian profits being stashed away in tax havens. Labor will cap the deductions for managing tax affairs at $3,000 and reforms to discretionary trust reforms. I've mentioned before the need to look to the future and look into the long term about making sure that such errors of what happened don't happen again. But I've also got to mention that the member for Pearce, the current Attorney-General, also must take some responsibility for his role in failing to act and campaign hard enough for a fair share of the GST when this problem emerged in 2011-2012. The now Attorney-General said when he was Treasurer of Western Australia, quote, "We reasonably anticipate that in 2013-14 the Commonwealth Grants Commission will have brought in a new GST system." Well, Deputy Speaker, that did not happen. It took many years. It took strong advocacy from my colleagues in the Labor Party, strong advocacy from the Shadow Treasurer, strong advocacy from Premier Mark McGowan, strong advocacy from WA Treasurer Ben Wyatt, and creative policy to ensure WA gets a fair share of the goods and services tax. Thank you.
I thank the member for Perth.